Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Habitat Podcast, the podcast for becoming better habitat managers. Guys, we are here to learn from all the experts out there, regular Joes, doing the best we can with the stuff we got, and we have a great episode today. Brian, my co-host, is on the line. What's up, buddy?
How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, man. I am fired up. Got an exciting episode. Pumped about all of our listeners. Thank the listeners for coming back. Thank you guys. And I'm excited, man. It's Friday. What's going on with you? You're over there in God's country.
Yeah, sitting here under the overhang of my cabin looking out on nothing but fields and woodlots, Northeast Ohio. Beautiful morning, sun shining, birds are chirping. Can't complain at all.
Oh man, I have the same view, except it's more of like a basement view. No, I can hear the birds chirping in the background, and oh man, what you doing up there?
Well, this is probably the longest stretch of dry weather we've had all year. So I'm hopeful to get the last half of my plots planted today. I got some mowing done yesterday, some spraying, took care of a couple of things I had to get done up. So hoping that everything stays on track and I'll get those backfields planted and be finished.
Yeah, you said you were working till like 9:30 last night, right?
Yeah, it stayed light till almost 9:30, and I've got headlights on the tractor. I've done that before, but it hasn't gotten that desperate yet. But yeah, it was great to have the sun around that long, and sure we're able to cram in a lot more work.
Nice job. And what do you have going on the rest of the weekend up there? You got some friends coming up?
Yeah, Dave and Chris, who you met at the ATA, and I've been BSing with on social media and whatnot. They'll be up here probably in about 5-6 hours after they get done working, and we'll be able to have a little more muscle to get a few more things accomplished.
That's awesome, man. Nice job. You're busting your ASS out there, and it's really gonna show come this fall. So I'm you're ahead of me. I'm more of a fall plot guy, so I got my screens planted. I got the disc and work those in. I'm gonna get out there and start spraying for the fall plantings here pretty soon, and actually waiting for the bid prospectus to come in for the logger. So we're gonna see how that goes as well. I'm gonna have the back 8 acres logged further and open up that canopy. So we'll see if anybody wants to mess with it. It's pretty small, so waiting for that, and just enjoying summer. So
What kind of timber do you have back there? Is it a mix or?
yeah, there's two different types. It's pretty wet, so there's swamp white oak, and or swamp oak and soft maple are the
Okay.
two big ones. And it was logged in the past, but they took really, really big trees out, and now I have a bunch of good sized trees that are still shading out the canopy, and I'm kind of at a point where I could let them go longer and get bigger and have more value, but my goal is for deer, and I really the undergrowth back there is not strong. It could be due that it's wet, and it could be that it just hasn't came back yet, but it's been a few years and there's really not much. So we're gonna try this route, dabble in it, see what happens, and I can take that investment and put it into something else at the farm to help the deer
Sure.
even more. So it might be a big
Great.
disruption right before deer season if they get it done this year. Um, but my neighbor logged his 2 years ago, right before deer season, and I shot a buck like a month later. So not that worried about it really.
Right.
But we have a really good episode tonight. Who's coming on, Brian?
Mr. 400 inches.
400 inches and $2. Anybody guess who that
One,
is?
one and only Don Higgins.
Yes, sir. Don Higgins from Higgins Outdoors gonna join us, and we're just fired up to talk to him. He's a great guy. We met him a while back, and he's just give you the shirt off of his back type of guy, which a lot of the people we talk to are, actually. But Don was just super nice, and we talked to Wes too, his partner at Real World, and but we got Don tonight. I'm just excited to pick his brain about how he goes about managing habitat and hunting. Really, some hunting strategy. I think we're going to talk about too.
Yeah, definitely. I've been planting real world soybeans. I think this is my fourth season now. And anytime I had a question, anytime I reach out to those guys, and I've had some conversations with Don over email, and he's always been very generous with his time and his knowledge, and it's really helped me out getting these things planted the correct way. And boy, it's just the way he goes, the way he approaches his scouting and setting up his farms and his trail camera strategies and his stand strategies. I think this is going to be a great episode. Our listeners are going to learn a lot from him.
Yep. Yeah, I can't wait to talk habitat strategy with Don. I mean, I've been following him for a while, and it seems like could learn a few things. So, well, let's before we get into that, let's talk about our sponsors and get down the line. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by 5-2 Outdoors. This is a new sponsor for the podcast, guys. Dale is the owner of this new store over in Jones, Michigan. Southern Michigan, border of Indiana, close to Ohio and Illinois also. Now, Dale is a longtime habitat manager, follower of the podcast, property owner himself, deer killer, and now opened a store representing Packer Max Cultipackers and Lazy Man Blinds. Guys, these blinds are pretty darn sweet too. Check them out online. He's the newest dealer, and they are two-piece all fiberglass blinds, and Dale sells them right there at 5-2 Outdoors. Be sure to go on our Facebook page and check him out. Like his page, and you'll be seeing more from myself and Dale coming up soon when I go down there to visit him. So, 5-2 Outdoors on Facebook and 52outdoors.com. Next is Nick Nation at the Habitat Hook. The Habitat Hook, guys, is from Nation's Creations. They also have been carrying watering holes. Now, these are watering holes like we build and put in the grounds ourselves, but they are actually made to look realistic besides the black poly tubs that you've seen me and Teddy Clark and some others using. So these things are pretty cool looking. There are two different sizes, a large and a medium, both available for pickup over at Nation's Creations. Once again, called the Earth Blind Watering Holes. Now, the large size measures 74 inches by 48 inches, and the medium is 48 by 48. Nick's got some cool pictures of deer actually utilizing these on his property on Facebook. So go to the Habitat Hook Facebook, see the watering holes. You can hook up with Nick and get yours for your property today. Lastly, Dip That Hydrographics. You guys want some cool stuff done, reach out to Gabe on Facebook at Dip That Hydrographics. I know Brian got his muzzleloader done. I'm going to get my 450 Bushmaster done and maybe another gun yet. So I know he's very good at hydrographic dipping. That's the film that lays on top of the water. And he'll do anything for you. You can do tumblers, you can do construction helmets, bow risers, whatever you guys want to get dipped. Be sure to check out Dip That Hydrographics and you will get a discount on your product. I also don't want to forget that you get discounts on the Habitat Hook as well from Nation's Creations. So guys, I want to thank our sponsors one more time. Dip That Hydrographics, the Habitat Hook, and 5-2 Outdoors. Now, without further ado, let's get Don Higgins on the line. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Habitat Podcast. We have Don Higgins on the line. How you doing tonight, Don?
Great. How you guys?
Well,
Very
Don
good.
Don is from Real World Wildlife Products and also Higgins Outdoors. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of you before, and if not, well, they're going to hear about you now. So, thanks for getting on tonight.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you guys having me. It's always a pleasure talking about deer hunting and habitat. So, I'm glad to do it.
Heck yeah! Well, I know when we met you at the ATA show, it was cool just how genuine of a guy you were, and and down to earth. And I mean, you struck up a conversation with us for shoot, it was probably 30 minutes, and just really nice of you. And you seemed like a normal guy like the rest of us, so it was really cool.
Well, thank you. I just, I tell a lot of people I'm just nothing but a simple country boy, chasing my dream like a lot of other guys in the deer hunting industry. So I'm always glad to talk with others and don't look down on anyone.
That's perfect. It's a good way to look at life. Well, normally we start this out with an introduction. We like to paint a picture for the listeners of who Don Higgins is, where you're from, what you do for a living, the whole backstory, maybe how you got bit with a deer hunting bug. Feel free to dive into that if you don't mind.
Sure. I live in central Illinois, where I've lived all my life. I actually got started or got interested in the outdoors at a very young age. I was so young I can't even remember when it started. I think I've had it my whole entire life. But I remember as a young kid, anything there was a season for around my central Illinois home, I was chasing it, whether it be fishing, trapping, hunting, whatever. And then when I was 16 years old, my third season of deer hunting, I shot my first deer, 9-point buck. And when I walked up on that deer, it was like my whole world changed. God just lit a passionate fire in my heart for whitetails. And within probably 5 years or so, I'd just about given up all other outdoor interests. The last time I was fishing was probably 25 years ago. I've never turkey hunted a day in my life. For me, it's just whitetails. And then as time went on, I just kept raising the bar and chasing bigger and bigger and older bucks. And that's my passion today. I just want to hunt the biggest, oldest bucks I can find, cover a lot of ground doing it. When I got out of high school, I worked about 20 years in a factory and eventually got out of there and started my own business, a tree nursery, and was a conservation tree planting contractor. And did that for, I don't know, probably close to 15 years, and just sold that business a couple of years ago. But, there's probably nobody in the hunting industry that's planted more trees than I have. I literally have planted several million.
Really?
Yikes.
Yeah, there was one spring that we planted 500,000 trees in 7 different states in the Midwest, and that was just one spring. Like I said, I did that for about 15 years. So I also worked as a conservation planting contractor, planting warm season native grasses. So I've got a lot of experience in that arena as well. I raised captive whitetails for nearly 25 years. Basically, it was a small research herd that I had. I just wanted to learn as much as I could about whitetails, so I got a few, and I did a lot of experiments. You couldn't call them really scientific because my sample size was so small that I didn't learn anything that I could publish scientific reports or anything. But I did learn a bunch about whitetails. Most of my studies focused on nutrition and genetics. There was 11 straight years where I artificially bred my does to some of the biggest bucks on earth, and basically studied antler genetics that way firsthand right here on my own farm. But like I said, I got rid of those captive deer 2 years ago. Today, I primarily work. I'm still pretty much multifaceted. I'm the co-owner of Real World Wildlife Products, food plot seed and deer nutrition company. My own Higgins Outdoors, where I do a lot of consulting work with landowners. Last winter, I was on 50-some properties in 9 states, meeting with landowners and developing plans for their property. So I got a lot of different irons in the fire. I write magazine articles. I started writing nearly 25 years ago. Had my first article published in North American Whitetail, but in the years since, I've had articles published in just about every major hunting magazine. I've written 2 books on hunting trophy whitetails, and I'm just a student of the whitetail. I don't consider myself an expert, but I just try to continually learn and get better at what I do, and share the knowledge that I've gained with others, and hopefully I can make a positive impact on their life somehow.
Wow. Wow. I've met a few people who have had captive deer or deer farms at some point or another in their life, and each person seems to be very, very knowledgeable about the whitetail. And maybe, that sounds obvious, but I think there are some advantages to that when you go out in the hunting in the woods. Have you noticed that? Has that helped you become a successful hunter or habitat manager, having deer of your own?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt about it. When you're with those animals 365 days a year, and you get to see that life cycle from the time those fawns are born until they're mature bucks 5 or 6 years old, and the genetics of those animals, and you can compare like a buck's rack to his father and grandfather's racks, and it just a lot of the things you learn really don't make you a better hunter, although some of them clearly do, but it just helps you learn about whitetails. And it's an experience that I'm glad I took part in. I never had a lot of deer. I think at the most I probably had about 40 at one time, but it definitely made me a much better hunter.
Very nice. Very nice. How big of a antler size or rack did you end up getting out of breeding those deer? What was your biggest one?
I had a couple that were over 300 inches.
Three?
Um, yeah, I mean that's not really that big for captive deer.
Okay.
Um, it was pretty easy for me to separate the captive from the wild. My heart is with the wild whitetail, no
Yeah.
doubt about it.
Yeah.
And it just the captive deer just helped me appreciate those wild animals all the more. I learned the vocalizations and just all kind of, especially the nutrition into things, and how a deer's needs and even their appetite changes so drastically throughout the course of a year.
Huh. Very cool. Well, thanks for that. Now you mentioned consulting and property plans or property tours. How long have you been doing that?
Somewhere, I don't know, around 10 years now.
Okay.
And it started by accident, really. I was, like I mentioned, I do outdoor writing, and some of the readers of my magazine articles would follow me, and I started getting email requests or calls from people, that said, "Hey, I've been reading your articles for years. I wondered if you'd mind coming and taking a look at my property and making some suggestions." And so, I'm never one to turn down an opportunity like that. So I started pursuing that a little bit, and then it just seemed every year grow a little bit more. And like last year, I did 50 some properties. That's about my limit because I don't want to do it unless I can really get a good feel for the property, and that means going in the winter months when the leaves are off the trees and such. So I start right after the firearm seasons, usually in about mid-December, and depending on the state. And then I go until things green up in the spring. So there's only about a 3.5, 4 month or so period there where I'm doing that. And, I'm about at my limit of how many I can do now with the other things I have going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were hunting and growing trees and cattle and raising deer along along the way, and then habitat management came along, kind of fell into your lap, if you will, for some of the articles of success you were having. What do you like the most out of all the different business endeavors you have going right now? Which one's the most enjoyable to you?
Wow, that's a tough question because I'm living the dream. I enjoy everything I do. The real world wildlife products, I enjoy testing those new products on the various properties that I either own or manage. Always trying to come up with something better than what I've already got as far as seed blends and such. Some of the when I had the captive deer, some of the things I learned about deer nutrition, I combined with some knowledge from like one of the leading whitetail veterinarians in the world, Dr. Shipley at the University of Illinois. A couple of livestock nutritionists, Dr. Aaron Gaines and Brent Ratliff. We've worked close with them to develop like our mineral and our deer feed supplements and such. So I really enjoy putting those new products together. But I don't know if I had to pin it down to one thing. It's probably meeting with landowners and consulting on their properties, and the reason is because it's just so rewarding. Is months or even a couple of years or so after you've been to a property, when you get a call or an email or a text with a photo, a guy just killed the biggest buck of his life, and he's giving you all the credit for it because of something you told him, or he says, "I killed this out of the tree where you tied the ribbon and told me to hang my stand." Even though I'm not the hunter shooting the buck, there's a great deal of satisfaction that comes from helping somebody else succeed.
Yeah, sure is. Sure is.
Now, Don, what's a day of consulting look like? How do you start out when you're approaching a new property, and maybe give us some tips on what you're looking for?
Okay, sure. Well, I do things probably a little bit different than most other consultants. Not saying my way's better or theirs is wrong or anything, but the first thing I want to do with any potential client is I got a series of about 10 questions I ask them, and they're related to their goals as a hunter, the hunting pressure on their property and around their property, what the hunting, the other activities that take place there, maybe fishing or small game hunting, turkey hunting or whatever. And then at the same time, I want to see an aerial of their property with the boundaries of the property marked on the aerial. So, I take the two pieces of information, that aerial as well as the information they give me from answering those questions, and I see if it's really possible for me to help them reach their goals. For example, if someone calls and their goal is out of line with the property they have to work with, I want to let them know before they ever spend a dime with me. I want to let them know the concerns I have first.
Sure.
I just as soon spend a little bit of time with somebody and not be paid for it, and be upfront with them and honest and get them off to a good start, as to just take their money and give them some information. But that's how it all starts. So it used to be that I would weed out about close to 50% of the potential clients just because I was so picky about who I would take. And
Right.
then there was a couple of instances where I was borderline on a couple of properties. I wasn't sure if I should take them or not, and I went ahead and did it. And once I got there, I was glad I did, because an aerial is only going to show you so much. There's no substitute for boots on the ground. So, once I agree to take on a client, I'll visit the property. I'll review all his information again, usually the evening before, and then when I get there, we'll tour the property. Usually like to start with either a drive around the area so I can get a kind of a feel for what's going on other properties.
Okay.
And sometimes I just do that on my drive to the farm before I even arrive. But then if we can kind of start by looking at the perimeter of the property, kind of follow the edge of the property boundaries, and then dig into the heart of it some, just depending on how big the property is and what we can see from the edge.
Right.
And, I tell everybody that they need to think of their property as one square and a giant checkerboard of other squares. If you was in an airplane looking down at 30,000 feet at your property, it's one tiny square, and there's a whole lot of other squares on that checkerboard. We got to do everything that we possibly can to get the deer in that area to want to spend as many daylight hours as possible on that one square. And that means setting it apart from the other squares around it. Now, what I found is that most people are pretty educated, on deer habitat. There's a lot of information out there anymore, like this podcast, for example, is just an excellent way for people to learn.
Right.
And creating good deer habitat is really not that difficult. In fact, it's pretty easy to go on a property and improve the habitat. Anybody can do it. What's a little more difficult is arranging that habitat in such a way that you can kill any buck that's living there. And that's my goal when I set up a property. I want that landowner to be able to kill the biggest buck running that property every year. And basically that's done there's no cookie cutter approach. You can't use the same approach on every property because every property is unique.
Sure.
And there's some properties where the bedding cover or the sanctuary is in the middle of the property, and there's some where it's on the edge of the property and the food's in the middle. And there's just, I don't know how many properties I've done now, but there's no two alike. They're just all different. You got different access points. You got different, the landowners got different goals. The hunting pressure around the property is different. One guy may have a lot of pressure on one side of his property, none on the other. So obviously you're going to want to pull those deer across the property to the direction where there's no pressure. And it's just, there's 1,000 different things you got to look at. But my ultimate goal is to put together a plan where that landowner can year after year consistently kill the biggest buck on that property. And I'll detail that plan in writing as well as a marked aerial. I'll send him a hard copy, printed out copy of the plan and the aerial. I'll also send them a digital copy via email. And then probably the thing that really sets me apart from a lot of other consultants is that I'll keep a copy of that plan on my computer. So any of my clients can call me 5 years down the road and they can say, hey, I got a question about food plot number 2 or tree stand number 10 or whatever. And I can pull up their aerial and their plan, and I can answer their question intelligently because I know exactly what they're talking about. I've got that aerial, that marked aerial right in front of me as they're asking the question.
Very nice.
So
That's cool.
That's kind of my approach to consulting in a nutshell.
Yeah, I like the way you put that about arranging the habitat changes. Because a lot of guys, like you said, they know what to do, but that becomes the hardest piece of the puzzle, I think, is to making sure you're arranging them the right way. I like the way you put that.
Well, that's really the key because, like I said, creating good habitats easy. Anyone should be able to go onto a property with the information that's available today. Anyone should be able to go to their property and increase the number of deer that are on that property, increase even the size of the bucks on that property. But what good does it do you to grow the biggest bucks in the whole county if you're not able to kill them?
Right.
So arranging those habitat improvements in such a way that you can benefit from them, I think, is the key.
Do you have a small list of things that you try to implement on every property, or does it go back to what you're saying that it's just so different for each one?
No, there is no list there's a long list of possible things that I'll suggest, but there's really nothing that I do. Well, I create a sanctuary, a bedding sanctuary on every property, but how it's laid out and what that cover consists of may vary from property to property. On an open property with a lot of open tillable acreage, that might mean fields of switchgrass. When on a heavily wooded property, it might mean logging, or maybe there's no timber of value, so it's got to be hinge cut or timber stand improvement or something done. So there's just a whole long list of possibilities, and everyone's different.
Right. Now, do you apply that sanctuary idea to any size property, or is there some properties that just get too small to try to institute something like that?
I always try to. One thing I always tell my clients is that to consistently kill mature bucks, you've got to hunt them on the properties they spend their daylight hours. That means where they bed. I fully believe if you're just one property over from where a buck beds, your odds of killing that buck are 10% what they are if he was on the same property. So I really, really try to get some mature bucks bedding on any property that I consult on.
Okay.
Wow.
Now, when you're seeing these properties all over the country when you're traveling, is there a couple of things you see that stand out that people make a lot of similar mistakes that you could talk about?
Well, yeah, if I could offer any advice, it would be, to a potential client. It would be to be open-minded when I get there. As I think a lot of clients try to make it harder than it really is. I think the internet is largely responsible for that because there's so much information out there, and there's a lot of good information as far as creating better deer habitat. But as far as really arranging that habitat in a way that you can kill a mature buck consistently, or just making your property better for mature bucks instead of deer in general, it's a little bit different game. So I think a lot of my clients will have preconceived ideas in their mind, and sometimes it's difficult for them to accept what I'm saying. When I go to meet with a new client, I can usually tell within the first hour that I'm there with them how well this is going to go for them.
Okay.
The ones that are really open-minded, those are the guys that I expect that I'm going to hear from in the next 2 years. They're going to send me a picture of a giant. And then sometimes, I'll go to the property, and not to bash anybody, because I certainly appreciate everyone that thinks enough of me to hire me, but sometimes I'll go to a property, and it's almost like the landowner has already got in his mind what he's going to do, and instead of being open-minded and listening to my ideas, he's telling me what he's already going to do. Well, I'm going to do this here, and I'm going to do that there, and so I try my best to offer a good service for each individual, because each one is different, and so I try to listen to the client and make sure that to the best of my ability I can offer him some value. Like I said, he thought enough of me to hire me. I want him to get something positive out of it. And
Sure.
So sometimes it's a little harder for me to do that than others. Sometimes I'll go to a property and the guy has already started habitat improvement and laying things down. He's done a fantastic job. He's done things that I can't argue with whatsoever. And I might just offer a couple of suggestions, and that's all he's going to get from me, because he's already done such a good job to start. That's about all I could do. But one thing that everybody can get from me is brutal honesty. And, sometimes I have to do things that's not the easiest for me to say to. But I think if they're paying me, my fee to come to their property, they deserve the truth. So
Right.
sometimes the truth is brutal, but, I think they all deserve it.
All right, Don. So you mentioned a couple great things there that got my attention. The whole setting up a property for a mature buck versus setting up a property for deer. Now, a lot of people, including myself, have set up a property to attract does or more deer, and then hopefully the buck follows, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean exactly? And can you give some examples of how maybe some of your landowners maybe have done it in the past to where they didn't set it up for a mature buck and they did set it up for deer only? Um, or maybe how somebody could make that mistake, because that's very interesting to me. I have a small property, and my goals are aligned with the mature buck goal, so I'm curious to know what those specific things could be, what the differences are.
Well, a mature buck desires freedom of human intrusion over anything, over food, over hot does, over anything. And a big mistake that I see on a lot of properties day after day in the wintertime when I'm out doing these visits, it's like I see, it's just, I can almost count on it, is that a lot of guys on their properties, they've got a series of trails and mowed paths where they're trying to access every square inch of their property or every acre. And they leave nothing for the deer. And it works for does and for younger bucks, but when you start getting a buck that's 5, 6 years old, he's not going to put up with a mowed path. He don't even want to walk a mowed path. Years ago, I used to mow paths through my switchgrass and through my weeds and stuff for the deer to follow. And I no longer do that, because the deer will follow it for sure, but a mature buck will not there's no absolutes. So, occasionally you'll
Yeah.
see them do it. But a mature buck would much rather have those weeds and briars and switchgrass and whatever. He'd rather have that right up against his side. And I just think that some people carry their habitat improvements to the extreme where they actually make it less attractive for a mature buck. It's more attractive for deer in general, but for an older mature buck, it's less attractive.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I've actually done that, and I can't say I've seen any mature bucks walk down those. I actually had some tall grass in between two food plots that the last mature buck I shot walked through. Not the food
Hmm.
plot on either side, but between he walked in the cover in between the two of them. That's actually very interesting. Um, what else do you have in mind for the a difference? I mean, are you putting little water holes out there? Are you just staying the heck out all year round, or what are you leaving half your property alone entirely?
Well, everything a mature buck does is hinges on the wind. So, what you can get away with hunting lesser deer, you cannot get away with a mature buck because, Roger Rothar years ago put it the best that I ever heard it. The wind has to be almost wrong for the hunter and almost right for the buck. You can't expect a buck to just hop on his feet and commit suicide, run around without paying attention to the wind. Everything he does is calculated, and the wind is part of that equation. So, when I'm setting up properties, it's like when I mark a stand on somebody's aerial, or when I'm on the visit, and I'm tying a ribbon to a tree and saying you need to stand here, I'm telling them exactly what wind direction and what time of season to hunt. I'm saying you want to hunt this tree on a northwest wind in the morning in November, early in the rut. And it's all, luck no longer. If you want to consistently kill big deer, luck's out the window. Luck
Right.
has nothing to do with it consistently. And so everything's calculated, and it starts by getting that buck to stay on that property. But once you get him staying there, you got to know how he's going to move on that property, when he's going to move, what wind direction he's going to use to get to that plot, or to check that bedding area for hot does or whatever. It's all got to be laid out in a calculated way so that luck's no longer the factor that determines are you going to kill a big deer this year or not. It's just not part of the equation any longer.
Okay, so that example with the wind being, almost wrong for you and almost right for the buck, can you kind of paint a picture on that? Say you have a 40-acre square, you have the buck bedding directly in the middle, and say you have, I guess, how would you portray that? Where would the stand be and which direction would you hunt? Could you paint that out a little bit in more detail?
Well, under ideal situation, you want that buck to be traveling with a wind quartering into his nose. He don't like to travel with a wind straight into his nose, but he likes for it to be quartering into his nose. And if you're just off to the other side of that trail, he's coming with that nose wind, but it's a quartering nose wind, and you're off to the other side. There's no way he can smell you. Now, what you got to factor in is where your scent's going, because he's going to want to smell as much of the area he's moving through as possible. He's not going to just commit suicide. So he wants to walk the edge of, whatever. A field edge, a lot of times he'll walk within the cover, but he's out on the edge of the woods. Or, like around a bluff, or where there's a big creek or a river makes a bend and there's a high bluff. That deer wants to hug that bluff so, that he can smell the cover there as much as possible. He don't want to just be walking through the middle and only be able to smell half of it. So just knowing how mature bucks travel using the wind is a big part of it. And then once you know that, then you can lay that property out to take advantage of that.
And that would
I hope
determine,
that all made sense.
yeah, so that would determine where you're putting your bedding, where you're putting your food, maybe the predominant wind direction, and then you would probably place your stands um, on how you can access them safely, right?
Exactly. So, it kind of starts with where you're going to make that deer bed or
Okay.
encourage that buck to bed. So once you know where he's bedding, it's no longer, deer hunting's no longer just a situation where you go out and you find some sign, or wherever you find the most sign, you throw your stand up and then you hunt it when the wind's blowing from the sign to you. you're hoping any deer that comes by don't smell you. Instead, it's all calculated.
Yeah.
You know where that buck's bedding, and then you pull him in whatever direction with features such as food plots.
Okay. Okay. So say he's bedded to the west. You have food plots straight east. So he's heading into the wind to the east, and say there's a northeast wind. That'd be quartering at his nose, right? Would that be
Right.
an ideal
Yep.
situation?
Yeah, depending on how everything's laid out.
Okay. So what if the wind is straight, basically across him from left to right? Do they travel that way very
They
often?
do a lot.
Okay.
Actually, especially in the morning, early in the rut, they will want to use a crosswind and run the downwind edge of thick bedding cover as they're looking for hot does.
Right.
They want that crosswind or a quartering wind, that's coming out of that cover into their nose.
Okay. And when you're setting up these stand locations, so you know where he beds. So like my property, there's a huge swamp to the west. That's where they bed. That's where they all come out of. Are there any other no-nos or special strategies that you would tell a normal landowner? Make sure you do this or make sure you don't do that. If you're trying to pull them from west to east, etc. I mean, do you have a rule on how far back towards the bed you go or hunting the edge of a plot? Do you have any rules like that or suggestions?
Well, I typically like to hunt closer to the bed than the food, but a lot of that depends on the pressure. If you get an unpressured property and deer move freely in daylight, you can set up about anywhere between the food and the bed. Later in the season, especially in brutal cold winter weather, I'll hunt closer to food. A big reason for that is it's a lot harder to get close to the bedding area. They can spot you from so much farther away when all the leaves are gone. But I don't know if that answers your question or
Yeah,
not. But
yeah.
Now, Don, we're doing everything we can to give these mature bucks a sanctuary and try to stay out of there. How do we go about setting up our trail cameras when we're first trying to figure out what they're doing? We don't want to put any pressure on them in the sanctuary, but how can we begin? Is there a time of year that you'll get into that sanctuary with cameras, or do you try to stay out of there completely?
I stay out of the sanctuaries. I've tried that years ago when the first cellular cameras came out. I tried that in a couple places, and you just it's almost impossible to slip into a mature buck's bedroom without him knowing it. Anymore, the more experience I get, I don't even care about daylight pictures anymore. What I want to know is a buck that I want to target, is he staying on the property where I'm hunting?
Okay.
And so I keep my cameras away from the sanctuary for sure, but also away from my stand sites for the most part. I don't care if I get his picture out in a field edge at midnight. That tells me he's around. That tells me how big he is. And I know if I know where he's at, I got a chance to kill him.
That's interesting. You don't put any cameras up by your tree stands.
Almost never. There's some bucks that the trail camera doesn't bother them whatsoever.
Right.
And there's others, you get their picture one time on a location, you're done. You're not getting his picture there again.
Yeah, that makes sense. I never thought of it like that. So
yeah,
what
they're
is
all
your
individual. I think that's
Right.
something that a lot of hunters don't realize is how different bucks are.
Yeah, that was one thing I noticed in that story about Smokey and Trump when you were telling us on trying to remember the what was it 13? I think the video was on YouTube.
Yeah,
That was interesting how
Great
you
video.
painted the picture of how different they were.
they were the extremes. Of all the mature bucks I hunted, Smokey was the easiest one I've ever hunted in my life, even though he was one of the biggest. And Trump was one of the hardest. In fact, I just wrote an article, sent it to Deer and Deer Hunting about a month ago on my toughest buck, and it was about Trump. There was just no rhyme or reason to what he was going to do next or where he would show up.
Huh. We're definitely going to get to that story, but I want to pick your brain a little more about the trail cameras. If you're not getting into the bedding area with them and you keep them away from your stands, how are you using those to get your to ambush these mature bucks?
Well, like I said, I'm using them more than anything to locate a buck and to figure out what bucks are on the properties I've got permission to hunt, to take inventory, if you will. So in the summertime, I'm basically putting those on feeding areas. I live in an area where ag is big, so we got a lot of soybean fields and alfalfa and things like that. So just through years of experience, I kind of know where the deer like to enter these different fields. For example, bachelor groups, I know exactly the bachelor groups stay in the same place every summer. So, if there's a bachelor group at a certain place this summer, they're going to be there year after year unless something major changes. And so I kind of learned the patterns of those different bachelor groups and the fields they like to feed in, the corners where they come out to feed and such. And that's where I'm focusing my cameras in the summertime. And then about the time they shed velvet in early September, I shift my cameras, and I'm putting them in funnel areas and, things like fence crossings and things like that. But also I use a lot of rope scrapes. You guys probably have heard of, hanging a piece of rope from a tree branch.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes, sir.
creating a scrape under it. I use that a lot. That's a really good way. If you've got a rope scrape on a property, you can inventory every buck there. You can get a picture of every buck on that property.
So you use a
I
scent
use that
on
a
that?
lot. I do. I use Smokies. The reason I like Smokies scents are made by a trapper, Smokey McNicholas, out of West Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not something that you can go down to your Walmart and buy. I don't want on my ropes. I don't want the same thing that the guy down the road's using to hunt with. He's
Right.
out there sitting in his stand smoking and doing whatever, not paying any attention to the wind. And he's got a certain brand of scent he's putting out. All he's doing is educating deer to that scent. So Smokey's is a little harder to come by. I get it directly from Smokey himself. He's got a handful of dealers, but you don't want something that every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the neighborhood using. You want something different, but you want something good. And I've used about every scent that Smokey's made and had great success with all of them. And I just love the fact that nobody else in the area is using it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's a great point.
Okay, so you got the inventory of the bucks with the rope scrape. We've got pictures of them where they like to feed. How do you take that information and determine where you're going to put your tree stands?
To be honest, the trail cameras do not tell me where to put my tree stands. It just experience tells me that. The only thing I'm really using the trail cameras for is to inventory bucks and to build history with a buck, his pattern. Like a lot of bucks will shift their range about the time they shed velvet in September, and I know a lot of it has been written about. A lot of magazine articles have been written about. Guys watch a buck in velvet all summer, and they're counting on putting their tag on him that fall, and come hunting season, the buck's disappeared. And
Sure.
There's a lot of different theories have been thrown out as to why they move, but the fact is that some bucks just have a separate fall, winter range than what they do a summer range. And so, I try to pick up on things like that. There's a buck right now that I watched, been getting his picture for about 3 summers. Last year, he would have pushed 200 inches. And if he would stay where he summers, I could hunt him on about 3 or 4 different properties I have permission to hunt. But the thing of it is that buck packs up about the time he sheds velvet. Last year, I got his last picture September 5th. And boom, he's gone. He goes and he moves about 1.5 miles. And I know exactly where he goes, but I just can't get permission on any properties where he goes. So it's frustrating when you see a pattern like that you can't capitalize on or find a buck like that. But, there's other bucks like here on my place. There's a buck that shows up here in October. He's not here all summer. He's not here in September, but in early October, he shows up. And he's a good one. Last year, he was a 5x6 11 pointer that would have been over 170 inches. This year, he'll be 6 years old, and I'll probably end up shooting him. But That buck is not here all summer. I've not got ever in my life if I got a single velvet picture of that buck, nor do I have one in September. He doesn't even show up till October. So, those kind of patterns you can pick up on. A couple of things that I've written about over the years. Back in 2003, I'd never seen this in print before or anywhere else, but I talked about same time, same place was the name of the article, where a buck will, when they shift range, they'll do it at almost the same date every year. And bucks seem to have an annual pattern. And I think too many times guys go out with their trail cameras and they're trying to pick up on the daily pattern. What's this buck doing? And, I got his picture for 3 times last week, and he was coming to this food plot, and so I'm going to go hunt near that food plot and capitalize on it. And, I don't think that happens too much, but the annual pattern is something that you can be and the reason that's so difficult is because you're always a step behind the buck.
Right.
But if you can pick up on that annual pattern, you can be waiting on him. So for example, this buck at my place that shows up in early October, I'm set up waiting for that buck to show up this October. There's other bucks that, they don't show up till late season. After the rut, they'll show up on my place because I've got more food here than anyone in the area. And so I draw in a lot of deer in the late season that we're not here in the rut. So, if I get a giant that doesn't show up until late season, I know I'm not going to shoot that deer in the rut. I got to wait till, the time he's here. So I kind of pick up on them annual patterns quite a bit as well. But, another thing that I wrote about, and I haven't seen, I'm really surprised that more people haven't, a lot of times when somebody throws out an idea, it's not long before a lot of people are repeating that idea.
Sure.
And nothing wrong with that by any means. But, one thing I threw out a couple of years ago, I did an article titled Homecoming Bucks. And really nobody seemed to catch on to it, but it's a definite pattern that you can take advantage of. And what that article was about was I've noticed that a lot of times a buck will return. Those bucks that have a summer range and a totally separate fall-winter range, well, they move to that fall-winter range usually about the time they shed velvet up through early October is when most of them move. But what happens a lot of times early in the rut, those bucks will make a journey back to where they summered. And it's usually around November 5th to the 8th. And what I think happens is those bucks go to their fall range, the rut's starting to heat up, and they cannot find a hot doe, that first hot doe. So what they do is they'll run back to where they summered looking for a hot doe. And usually a lot of those pictures I get are at night. But it's usually only one time, and then he's gone. You don't get him again the rest of the rut.
Wow.
They'll also do it at the very, very end of the rut, around Thanksgiving weekend or such. Those bucks that summered there but left for the fall will make a return trip late in the rut looking for a hot doe. And I'm telling you, sometimes it'll only last it might be overnight. At one night he runs back and he's gone before daylight, so there's nothing you could really do about it, even if you knew. But if you can pick up on those patterns with your trail cameras as you're watching that buck grow up, what I found is trail cameras make it almost easy to kill mature bucks, because most of them that I'm hunting, I've watched through trail cameras for, anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 years. So by the time back in 2014 and 15, 2 years in a row, my target buck I shot the very first day I ever hunted him. And the one in 2014, he wasn't that big of a buck. He was a 4-year-old cull buck, but I knew what he was going to do. So, and there's a certain amount of luck to that. Don't get me wrong, but I knew what that buck was going to do before he did it, and I was there waiting on him. In the first hunt, I shot him. And in 2015, that buck was a 6.5-year-old 180-inch buck that I'd watched grow up since he was a year and a half. He had always had, at least, even as a yearling, he had 6 points on each side. And so I was watching him from the time he was a yearling. And when it finally came time to hunt him, he was 6.5 years old, and I went in, and the pattern I put together was he was using this little wooded draw. he would come in there during the rut to look for does. So there was a lot of does that like to bed in that draw. But every year I'd have cameras in that draw, and he would not show up until about November 6th would be his first visit. And his last visit to that draw would be about November 20th. So I had about a 2-week window there in the middle of November when that buck was hitting that draw looking for does. So I had my stand set, and I totally stayed away until November 6th is when I wanted to go in. Well, it just so happened on the 6th, the wind was wrong for either of my two stands in that draw, and November 7th, the wind was wrong. Finally, November 8th, I got a switch in the wind and could get in that draw and hunt. I killed that buck the first morning I'd ever hunted him, and I'd watched him for 6 years. And that was all possible because of the trail cameras I had in that draw for the previous years.
Jeez.
Okay.
So I'm using my trail cameras this year. I'm getting information that I'm not even going to utilize this year. I'll use it in future seasons.
Yep.
Gotcha.
No, I've heard of that on multiple podcasts, and I keep all my mature buck sightings from the trail cameras in a file. I should be better at reviewing those prior to season, and I will be this year. Now, out of curiosity, how many cameras are you running, Don, and what kind are they? And I mean, do you hook up big 12-volt batteries to them, or are they cellular? Or tell me about those. How many?
Well, I've got over 50,
Oh, wow.
somewhere between 50 and 60. But I'm running them on about five or six different counties around my home. So I mean, I'm covering a lot of ground. And Reconics is the camera that I've had the best luck with. They're pretty expensive, so all of them that I have aren't Reconics. I've also got some Exodus. I've got 5 or 6 Spartans cell cams. Those are the only cell cams I have of those 5 Spartans. They got some coverts, Browning. I've got a little bit of everything, but really hands down, Reconics is without a doubt the best camera on the market.
Okay.
In my opinion. So.
Yeah. And how are you powering all these? Just are you rechargeable double A's? Are you lithiums, or how are you doing that?
Just ultimate lithiums.
Okay.
Those Reconics are good for about 40,000 pictures in one set of batteries.
Holy
So
cow.
most of those cameras I will go through no more than 2 sets of batteries.
So,
That gives me 80,000 pictures. It's not very many locations where I'm going to get 80,000 pictures. I put them out about July 1st. I don't go too early because I want to make sure when I first put them out that the bucks have enough antler growth
yeah.
that you can tell individual bucks. So I start about July 1st and I pull them about March 1st or somewhere in March.
Okay.
So during that time, 2 sets of batteries and a Reconics will pretty much take me through, and some of them 1 set.
Well, so whatever you're spending in terms of a higher trail camera price, you're saving in battery costs. So,
Well, and dependability too. I mean,
yeah.
every Reconics I've ever bought, I'm still using them, except for a few of them that I had stolen. So.
Okay. Okay. Now, I want to get into how your 2017 season, how you killed the buck you named Trump using your trail cameras. And another question, how'd you come up with the name Trump? I'm curious.
Well, I came up with the name Trump. The buck that I ended up naming Trump in the summer of 2016, the last presidential election, this buck shows up on my trail cameras. I didn't even notice it or didn't even recognize it first. He just exploded in antler growth. The year before, he was probably about a 160-inch buck. And I really had to go back and study some trail cameras to figure out which buck he was, because in 16 he was easily in the 190s.
Holy cow.
He blew up and put at least 30 some inches on and some stickers and stuff. But when I went back and studied trail camera pictures from that same location in previous years, there was no doubt which buck it ended up being. And, being a conservative, I was a big Trump supporter. The election, was heating up. And so I just had to I don't know, tell the world my political views by naming that buck Trump. So that's how I got his name. But as far as how I use trail cameras to end up shooting that deer, he's a buck that changed his range from his. He had a separate summer range that he did fall and winter, and I'd get his picture every summer, but I had no idea where he went in the fall and winter. And then he explodes, and I know that I want to kill him, but I have no idea where to do it at. I know his summer range, but I don't have any idea where his fall winter range was at. But a couple of things I did know is I didn't think he went to the west, because there was a property to the west that I hunted, and I never had his picture there. And I didn't think he went to the north, because I had a property to the north that I hunted and always had cameras and never had his picture there. So I kind of surmised that he must be going to the south or the east. So what I did that summer when he blew up is I went to the south and the east, and I just knocked on doors and got permission on as many properties as I could in that direction. And I just flooded that area for about, from his summer range to the south and east for about 3 miles. Every property I could get permission, I put trail cameras. I didn't hang stands to hunt, because I didn't know if he even ran some of the properties.
Wow.
Or any of them, really. So I just went that direction, and I kind of flooded the area with trail cameras, and I got his picture on several of them.
No way.
Yeah, the thing that I noticed was that there was absolutely no rhyme or reason to what that buck was going to do, or where he would show up next or anything. And he moved almost always at night, and he covered a big range. There was one point I got 2 pictures of him 3 miles apart, and those 2 pictures were taken 17 hours apart.
Oh,
so
geez.
in 17 hours, he covered 3 miles.
Wow.
And so I had a handful of places where I'd got his picture on different properties and such. But boy, the more I thought about it, coming into, and that was the season I would have shot that deer in 2016, but I never laid eyes on him. The summer of 2017, there he is back again in velvet, bigger than ever. So I had my cameras out again all over, and he was pretty much staying in his summer range, but there was absolutely no rhyme or reason, because, he was hanging out in a bachelor group with some other bucks, but those other bucks, I would get their picture in daylight, and he would not be with them in daylight, but at night, he would be with them. So he would stay bedded in the cover during the day, and just very, very tough buck to put any kind of pattern to. So what I kind of concluded was that, and I had stands everywhere that I'd got his picture the year before. That spring, I was putting stands up in all those locations to hunt him. But as the season opened, I thought to myself, you know what, if I just start jumping around from here and there and everywhere, I'm always probably going to be one step behind him. So what I need to do is I need to figure out the very best place in his range that I know where he's at, and I just need to hammer that spot. Well, it turned out that where he summered at, he would stay there. The pattern that I'd picked up in previous years, he would stay there where he summered until the crops were harvested. There was 100 acres that sits between 2 fence rows, and those crops between those, in that 100 acres between those 2 fence rows, was always the last crops in the area to be harvested. That the farmer that farms those fields does not live local. He has to travel a ways, and that's his last field that he harvests. And by the time he gets there, everything else in that area has been harvested. So what would happen is Trump's range, he lived in the crops, Trump did, in the corn and standing soybeans. So as the fields were being harvested, his home range would shrink. And then once it got shrunk down to that 100 acres between them fence rows, that's where he stayed until they were gone. And that's when he moved to his fall winter range. So my plan going into the season was I was just going to hunt that 100 acres, the fence rows around them standing crops, until those crops were harvested. I was just going to pound them day after day. And that's what I did. And the first 9 hunts that I was out there hunting him, I did not see a single deer, not one deer, not a fawn.
Holy cow.
And but I just kept pounding away, because I knew that if I started jumping around, I was going to be one step behind him. I just stay there, and it's something I never did. I hadn't done that for years. I mean, decades before, since I had pounded stands as hard as I did those. But I kind of thought that, if he's not here, how's he ever going to smell that I was here? Smell my ground scent, or how am I going to spook him? So I'll
Touche.
just keep pounding away till he shows up. And sure enough, on the 10th hunt for him, he showed up, and I was able to get a shot and kill him.
Wow.
And did you know he was in there from the trail cameras the year before or from the trail camera in 17 that year?
Well, incidentally, I had shot Smokey, the other buck I shot that year, on October 15th, and a couple days later, I didn't hunt again for a couple days, 3 or 4 days actually,
Well,
until
real
the
quick,
19th.
how big was Smokey? Real quick, just so everybody knows.
Yeah, Smokey was 206 inches, and so I shot him on the 15th, and he was on my farm.
Okay.
And so I was dealing with him and getting caught up on some chores around home and stuff, and I didn't hunt again until the 19th. Well, on the 17th, the evening of the 17th, I'm taking Smokey to the taxidermist, and my cell phone goes off. I had a picture on one of my Spartan cameras, and it's probably 30 minutes before sunset. I opened up that picture and I couldn't believe it. There's Trump walking by one of my stands, and this is a situation where there really was no other place to put the camera except close to a stand. So there he is walking by my stand in daylight 2 days after I just shot Smokey. So to see him on his feet just confirmed that he was in that area. Well, the next day, my grandsons were here from Indiana, and I spent time with them when I didn't go hunting that day. But then the following day was the 19th, so I slipped in. I could not hunt the stand that he had walked by 2 days before because the wind wasn't right for that stand. But I had another one about 150, 200 yards away that I could hunt with that wind. And that's what I did, and ended up getting a shot and killing him.
Wow. Nice work on that. I don't know if we've ever, well, maybe at ATA we personally told you, but nice job once again. That's awesome.
Well,
What a hell of
thank
a
you. It
year.
was, I've got to admit, on that one, there was as much luck involved as anything. Now, Smokey was, it was kind of a no-brainer, but
Yeah.
Trump, there was a big dose of luck involved with that one.
If anybody
Yeah,
wants to,
I can't remember back in 2017, right before you killed Smokey. You were on a podcast or maybe a video I saw on YouTube, but you were talking about him and you said, anything can happen, but I'm pretty confident about this 200-inch Smokey. I'm just waiting for the right wind, and it was just like incredible. A couple of days later, I saw your picture with him.
Yeah, I knew I was going to kill that buck, but ironically, I shot Smokey. It was on October 15th. It was a Sunday evening, and 2 days later, on Tuesday, I did a podcast, and I can't even remember now who I did the podcast with, but I told them on the podcast that they asked what now, you're allowed 2 bucks in Illinois, what are you going to do with your second tag? And I said, well, I'm going to be after Trump, but I'll be honest, my odds of even laying eyes on Trump is about 1%, let alone killing him. Just laying eyes on that buck in daylight was my goal for the rest of the season. And I told them, I said, my odds of that happening are about 1%. And as luck would have it, the very next time I went out, I shot him.
jeez, that's
Incredible.
incredible.
Well, I'll take luck over skill any day.
Yeah. Couple prayers upstairs too. I'm sure helped that.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
now there's something you mentioned earlier, and this kind of relates to this as well. We're trying to relate how you know where to hang your stands. With some of the habitat setup and setting up properties, okay, that's one thing. But when you're combing the landscape for a mature deer that you want to kill, and you have cameras over 3 miles, you get your picture, you have your intel. You said your experience dictates on where you put that stand. Can you dive into that at all? On maybe what happened with Trump and where you set up there to get a shot, which I believe was at like 15 yards or something on that deer.
Yeah. Most of the stands I hang, the stand location is dictated by terrain and wind. So the terrain tells me where to put my stand, and the wind tells me when to hunt it. So on the hunt for Trump, the stand I shot him from was on a hedgerow, but so I was on that narrow hedgerow, overlooking an ag field, but right where I had my stand, a soybean field and a corn field came together. So I'm looking straight out of my stand into the crop, but I'm looking right down the line where soybeans and the corn meet.
Oh,
And so anytime you have multiple different types of cover coming together, it's always good. But the more different kinds of terrain and such, the better, or types of vegetation. For instance, the very best spot on my farm, there's about 5 different types of terrain that come together. There's a conifer or spruce thicket. There's an open ag field. There's a wooded thicket. There's a food plot, and there's a big field of switchgrass, and all these things kind of corner up together in this one little spot. It's the best spot on my farm. I can kill any buck that shows up here in that one spot.
no
So
way.
the more
Wow.
different types of terrain or cover that comes together in one location, the better.
Yeah, yeah, and people kind of refer to that as edge sometimes too, right? These deer are creatures of edge, and you have all those
Yep.
edges coming together. And in Trump's case, the edges of the two crops too. So he walked out of the corn right into the wood line you were on. Is that how it worked?
No, he was. It was a dead calm evening. I mean, it was calm. It was so calm. I mean, you could hear a mouse running through the corn stalks at 100 yards. And I'm sitting there in that stand overlooking that cornfield where it met the bean field. And I heard a single rustle of a corn stalk out in that corn, sounding like it was about 30, 40 yards out. And I knew it was a deer. So I stood up in my stand. I had no idea, but it's the only rustling I heard. So how he ever slipped through the rest of that corn, I have no idea without me hearing him. But he slipped out and he stepped into the standing soybeans about 30 yards out from me. And then when he
Jeez.
came out into that soybeans, he's right on the edge of where they met the corn. Then he turns and he walks straight at me. And when he gets to the wooded edge, then he turns. I knew he would. It's just a matter of which way he turns. So he walked straight at me till he hit the edge of that hedgerow, and then he turned. And when he did, that's when I shot.
You make it. Where'd you hit him?
I hit him in the base of the neck, actually.
Okay.
So I had quite a tracking job the next day. But
I can't believe you even held your nerves together. Yeah, I might have flung one over his back or something at that close a distance, that big a buck. Good night.
yeah, well, I luck over skill. That's all I can say.
No, that's awesome. Thanks for diving into all that. I think there were plenty of good tidbits information there. I'm gonna have to listen to that over again. Trying to focus here, but yeah, that's a great story. I mean, two amazing bucks. I think in that video on YouTube titled 13, you said it was 400 inches of antler between the two deer. What did Trump end up scoring?
Yeah, Smokey scored 206 and 6/8, and Trump scored 193 and 3/8.
Wow.
So it
Wow.
totals up just to an eighth over 400 inches. But
Crazy.
Wow. That's awesome.
well, definitely blessed, that's for sure.
All
Well,
right.
Don, I want to switch gears here a little bit and get into the real world wildlife products.
Okay.
I've been planting the soybeans for about the last 4 or 5 years on my farm in Northeast Ohio. Had a lot of great success with them. Great product. You want to walk us through how you got into the soybean food plot business and the progression that's made since you started it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a story. To be honest, way back probably, I'm just going to guess 25 years ago. I met a gentleman, Todd Hewing, who's become a really good friend of mine. But met Todd, and he was into food plots and management before it was even popular, even being considered by most people. And he was, at that time, I think he was planting about 60 acres of plots on different properties that he owns and his family owns. But him and I got into a little argument about what was better for the late season, corn or soybeans. And, I was a big believer that the carbohydrates offered by the corn were the ticket. And Todd and I argued, and he said, "I'll tell you what, you come down and I'll put you in a stand overlooking both standing corn and standing soybeans, and you tell me which the deer prefer." And so that's exactly what happened. I went and hunted with Todd, and he put me over a plot that was half standing corn and half standing beans. And that first evening, I probably seen 30 or so deer. And I seen deer walk right through that standing corn without even breaking stride until they got to the soybeans, and they stopped and fed. And, by the time I was slipping out of my stand, every one of those 30 or so deer were in the standing soybeans and made a believer out of me.
Wow.
So, almost instantly the next spring, I'm planting soybeans on my farm, and just getting seed from my neighbors who are big farmers and seed they had left. And I did that for a few years, and there was some years it worked out fantastic. The soybeans would be there in the winter, and the deer would be there just hammering them. But sometimes those soybean pods would shatter open, and the soybeans would all be laying in the mud or the snow where the deer couldn't get them. And on those years, my hunting suffered because of it. So I started looking for varieties of soybeans, basically that were more shatter resistant, to take care of that issue. And, in the process, we tested numerous varieties, and came up with some that did seem to not shatter as bad, and ended up, we wasn't doing this to start a seed company or anything. It was basically just to have the best plots we have on our own property. So
Sure.
The next thing we know, we've got other people, local people, what soybean do you plant? What soybean do you plant? Get me some. And one thing led to another, and it was those soybeans that, kind of started off Real World. I even planted the forage soybeans. There's people saying, "Oh, you need to plant these forage soybeans. They get so much taller and they're so much better," and this and that. 5 years in a row, I planted the forage soybeans right next to the soybeans we were testing for Real World. And every time, they were fine in the summer, but we tested the leaves, sent them to an independent test or independent lab, and they never were any better than the ag beans. In fact, most of the time, the ag beans had a lot better nutrient levels as far as protein and calcium and total digestible nutrients and things like that. So I think the forage soybean has its place. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think it's in the Midwest, and southern states is a different story. But anyway, that's kind of the story in a nutshell of how Real World got started, and it all started with the soybeans.
Can you go into a little more detail on the shatter resistance for some of our listeners that might not understand that?
Yeah, soybean shatter is basically when that plant dries down, it matures, the grain is fully developed, the plant matures, and then it dies. It's went through its life cycle. Some soybean varieties, that pod that holds the grain will actually burst open, and it'll drop that grain out of the pod, and you'll just have like an empty pod burst open hanging on your plant, but the grain is no longer there. And the grain is where all the nutrients are for the deer. So you need that soybean grain to remain in the pod. That's why shatter resistance is so important. And, as time went by, we continue to this day, we still plant new soybean varieties every year, looking to improve on what we're already doing. And at one point, we was noticing some soybean varieties that in our test plots, the deer would really hammer them in the green stage, that browse, a lot harder than others. And so we was sending the tissue samples in for testing on those, and what we discovered was that some of these higher oil soybeans are a whole lot more palatable to the deer. So we shifted our focus there for a few years, and we started testing soybeans for not only shatter but for oil content. They're a lot more palatable. Okay. And so that's where the Generation 2 comes in.
Oh, okay.
Now, I've got a selfish question here because, like you, I'm getting pounded with rain here in Ohio.
Uh-huh.
I got 2 of my 4 soybean fields planted with the Gen 2 beans. What is the latest? Where am I going to start fencing with the devil here date-wise for trying to get the other 2 fields planted?
Well, I think you can definitely go into July. I wouldn't want to go too much past the July 4th weekend.
Okay.
If you went a week or so past, you'd probably be all right. The thing of it is, those later planted beans will usually do fine. They won't get as tall. They won't produce as much grain, and they'll maybe stay green a little longer in the fall. But there should still be some beans there, provided they don't get wiped out.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed we've got these later starts to the warmer weather, but that also seems to be affecting our frost dates in the fall too. They seem to be getting pushed back a little bit. So
Right.
I'm hopeful that we'll get a few more weeks out of the frost date towards the fall here too. So hopefully that'll help.
Well, we haven't had normal, what I would call normal weather for some time now. It seems
Right.
like every year is just some other extreme that we haven't seen before.
For sure. Now, what other products have you started getting into along with the soybeans once you got established with that?
Well, we had a clover blend right out of the gate, and I think we've put so much focus on our soybeans that our clover kind of gets overlooked. I would stack our clover up with any clover on the market in terms of value, what you're getting for your money, as well as attraction. We did a lot of testing with different varieties of clover to come up with what's in that blend. We got a blend for upland game, for folks that are not necessarily deer hunters, but like pheasants, quail, rabbits, whatever. And then we got some fall planted blends, harvest salad. We got an oat. Deadly Dozen is probably our biggest seller now. If not, it probably will be this year if it hasn't been in the past. It's a combination of 12 different seed species. So when you plant that Deadly Dozen is actually what Smokey was in. If you watch the video of me shooting Smokey, he was coming out to a Deadly Dozen plot. What I like about it is there's something in that blend that the deer like from the time it first germinates clear through until the next spring. At all points of the season, they're going to be hammering it because there's going to be something in that 12 seed mix that they're going to be hammering. And it doesn't matter if you're out there the first day of October when season opens, or in the rut, or in January, the last day of season, they're going to still be hammering that plot as long as it's not, demolished by then.
Sure.
Because there's something in there that's going to be attractive. Each plant has a different window where it's most attractive to the deer. So they're not going to be eating the same thing in January that they were in October, but something else in that blend is going to become real attractive.
Right.
Now, Don, when it's this wet, we haven't had a spring like this wet around here, at least in a long time. What other seed varieties do you recommend that us habitat managers can look at in terms of the type of seed for up here in Michigan, Illinois, or even down, into Iowa, Missouri for if beans aren't going to make it, say July is still too wet, what's your backup plan?
Well, the best thing about a spring plot is that if it doesn't work out, you can always salvage it with a fall planted blend. And
Yep.
Deadly, like I said, Deadly Dozen is my favorite. So I've got one soybean plot on my farm. It's just in a spot where there's a lot of deer traffic, and I planted it twice this spring, and it just gets wiped out by the deer. So at this point, I'm probably just going to give up and come in with some Deadly Dozen this fall and salvage it that way. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, there's probably not a better fall planted blend available than Deadly Dozen, just because of the reasons I explained.
Okay, and can you name off the 12 varieties that are in that Deadly Dozen? It's like a math quiz or a
Oh, I can
spelling
probably
bee.
come up with most of them. There's oats, winter hardy oats. There's winter wheat, Austrian winter peas, rye grain, turnips, radish, sugar beets, brassica, rape, kale, crimson clover. You know how many that is? Is that 12?
11. That's pretty darn good, Don.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think
yeah, I'd
of
have to.
anything you might have missed there. I mean, you have everything I plant. and more, obviously.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
okay. Well, that's some good advice for guys like me who food plots are still, a mud fest. So I hope the listeners can learn something from that. Now, I want to be respectful of your time. We've been going at it for a little while here. What else you want to talk about tonight on your end? I know we've been drilling you. Do you have anything that you want to cover?
Oh, I'm always open to talking about anything. Um,
Okay.
well, I don't know. You kind of surprised me with that question. I'm usually not left speechless like this, but
I
yeah, I
have
just
I have that
I guess
effect
if I
on
want to
people
talk about
sometimes.
anything, it'd be the blessing that the hunting industry has been to me. I just appreciate all the support that guys like you and our customers at Real World, and my consulting clients and all that. Like I said earlier, I'm living the dream, but it wouldn't be possible without good folks that support me, and it's been a real blessing. And I just like to thank everyone who's been a customer of Real World or a client of mine, and just thank them.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and like I said when we met you at the show, I mean, you could tell right off the bat, just a real great, genuine person. And it was, very nice to meet you and glad to say I know you. So
Well, thank you.
yep, yep.
Like I said, I know God didn't make me any better than He made anyone else, and killing big deer is not a very important thing to do in life, and I'm just blessed to chase my passion. But I don't look.
That's one thing that always comes up when your name's mentioned, Don, is your humble approach, always giving back. The other thing I like too, you're always giving credit to the guys that laid the path before all of us, like Barry Wenzel and Roger Rothar. And I think it's important for the new generation to remember those guys, hear their names, pick up their books, and just keep that whole thing going too.
Well, absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned those guys because a lot of what I know today is just something I picked up from others, and I'm just passing it on. And a good friend of mine, Alan Foster, he used to write for North American Whitetail in the late '80s and early '90s. Just happens to I happened to start working with Al when I was like an 18-year-old kid, and he was older than me, and he was doing what I dreamed of, and that was shooting big bucks on a consistent basis. So I was kind of blessed to get to know him at an early age, and I've said many times that he's probably saved me 10 years on the learning curve. The things he taught me just made me a much better hunter much quicker than if I had to go out and learn them on my own. And the
Sure.
Wenzels and Roger Rothar, back when I was a kid, I would write letters to them because we didn't have email and things like that back in those days. It was handwritten letters.
Sure.
So I remember writing letters to those guys and them guys taking the time to answer my letters. And a big reason of why I've had the success as a deer hunter that I've had is because of people that have come before me, and I don't ever want to forget that. And hopefully I can pass some of that on, and some of the younger hunters can pick up things from me. And who knows, 20, 30 years down the road, maybe they'll be in a position like I am today, and they may mention my name long after I'm gone.
That's great.
All about that legacy. That's awesome. I had one more thing I wanted to ask you since you were the owner of a nursery, and I've asked this question a few times on the podcast. I forgot the last couple episodes, but what is your favorite tree, habitat or hunting related, of all time?
Favorite tree species?
Yeah, one that you guys, one that you planted or hung out of or grew up at the nursery, and you can have a couple. But what's your go-to favorite tree?
Oh, it would probably be, wow. Well, I like swamp white oaks.
Okay.
That's probably my favorite oak. They produce acorns that the deer love at a young age. I remember back in the day when sawtooth oaks, which is a non-native, it's an Asian oak, became the rage, and people would talk about, oh, they have acorns for 5 years and that. Well, I've grown in the nursery swamp white oaks right next to sawtooths, and the native swamp whites are producing acorns every bit as fast, if not faster. And the deer love them just as much. So the swamp white is probably my favorite deciduous tree. I've done a lot of habitat work using eastern red cedars. I like those real well. I know in some parts of the country they're considered almost a nuisance or a weed, but in my part of the Midwest, they make some fantastic bedding cover and screening cover. So that's a tree that I like a lot. Persimmons, there's not a lot. I'm kind of on the line. You go south of me a little ways, and there's quite a few persimmons, but if you go north from where I live, there's not many. So I'm kind of right on that line, and if you can find a persimmon tree in my neck of the woods, the deer are going to be hammering it. So that's
Wow.
one I like real well too. Chestnuts, the Dunstan chestnut is kind of the big rage right now. I can tell you, I did an article on Dunstan chestnuts a few years ago for North American Whitetail, and in the process of researching that article, I interviewed a guy at Ohio State University and another one at the University of Missouri. Both are chestnut experts, and both guys who know a whole lot more about chestnuts than I do said that they don't believe that the Dunstan chestnut is really a cross between the Chinese and American. They said that every characteristic it exhibits is the Chinese chestnut. They just think it's a Chinese with some fancy marketing.
Huh.
And from what I've seen in my nursery and growing on my farm, I can't tell the difference either. So, but a chestnut is a tree that every critter in the woods loves chestnuts. So that's a tree I really like as well too. So I don't know. I named off about 4 or 5 there. I didn't narrow it down to one, but I gave you a little bit of reasons of why I liked each one.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
that was awesome.
Awesome.
That's better than just one. That's interesting you say about the Dunstan being a maybe just the Chinese being a marketing version of that. We had a post on Dunstans on our Facebook page. If you get bored, Don, check it out. There's all kinds of comments on my 4 out of 6 failed that I planted last spring. And I asked
Mm-hmm.
a few questions, and there's all kinds of different stuff coming on there. A lot of guys were saying, well, not a lot, but if you were saying go to the Chinese, buy
Yep.
from more of a local nursery. I bought mine from the Chestnut Hill that were delivered at the local Walmart. That was the raging Facebook post I saw about 2 years ago, so that's what I did. And
Uh-huh.
so I mean, it's just check it out. I'd be curious to see what you think about that, and maybe you can shed some light on why 4 out of the 6 failed. A couple of them look really good, but the rest don't seem to have made it. So
Well, I could tell you 2 things about chestnuts. One, they do not like wet feet. You got to plant them on a dry side. If it's too wet, it'll kill them.
yeah,
The other thing is the pH. If the soil's too sweet, you got too much lime, they don't like that at all either. They'll get chlorosis. The leaves will turn yellow and the tree will usually die. So low pH and dry site. Those are 2 keys for growing chestnuts.
well the low pH is I got that covered. The
Yeah.
dry site this year, yeah, that sounds like it could have been the issue if they didn't come out of the dormancy. Or I mean, they look good in the fall, and then the spring they're just not there. And like I said, my area is still just a mud plot, so
Hmm.
that could be it. That could be it.
Good chance.
Okay. Well, cool, Don. Thank you so much for coming on. I just want to hit how everyone can find you. If you want to list off your website where people can find you, and maybe some of the services and seminars coming up that people could attend.
Yeah, absolutely. My personal website is higginsoutdoors.com. You'll find information on my consulting. I'm also a real estate agent in the state of Illinois. One new thing that I just started this past spring was holding what I call a whitetail master course on my home farm, and it's kind of a 1-day class where it's about half in the classroom and half in the field, where we go. I'll show slides and video footage that I've taken from actual tree stands and mature bucks on my property. And then we'll go look at those exact stands, and I'll explain why my stand's there and how I played the wind and how the buck was using the wind. And it's, for example, where I shot Smokey, you can go right up in the blind where I shot Smokey and see where that happened. But not only that, several other Boone and Crockett class bucks. That information is on HigginsOutdoors.com, and then RealWorldWildlifeProducts.com has all our seed blends, maximizer mineral information on that product, and our Expect Healthy Deer technology. RealWorldWildlifeProducts.com, and anyone that's got questions or whatever, I try to answer every email that comes my way. I'm sure a few might slip through the cracks. If that happens to you and you're listening, send it again, because I try to answer all. I appreciate anyone that looks to me for information. So if you sent me something I didn't respond, send it again. But if you never have and want to, feel free to do so.
That's great. That's great. Don, thank you very much for coming on. That was an excellent podcast. Um, I just want to say thank you. It's full of information, and we really appreciate your time here at the Habitat Podcast. So thanks again, man.
Yeah.
Wow, guys. I say it a lot, but wow. What another great episode here at the Habitat Podcast. Brian, my man, how you feeling? What'd you think?
I know we're getting a pretty good log of hunting information that I'm going to have to do a lot of earmarking for October. Go back and listen to these guys, because it's just been some incredible information rolling in. And thanks again to Don. Just a great guy. He's so generous with his time and his information, and just everything he could offer. And he really went into detail, and I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. I know I did.
Yeah, me too. I mean, like I always say, and probably gets old, I have literally a full page of notes here. Um, and when you're running a podcast, you're not always as, I don't know, maybe listening the best you should be when you're focusing on what's next and everything else. So it's always fun for me to listen to these, a second and third time
No doubt.
afterwards. And this one is going to be epic. I mean, Don, thank you so much for coming on, first of all. And then, just seems like a great guy, and he is a great guy. We met him, but what a hunter and what a habitat manager. I mean, I know it's still only June, but almost July, but all I can think about is, the reason we're doing all this is for hunting season. So I think we're gonna get more and more into the hunting side of things, with Mike Perry on last week and Don this week, and then we got a special episode number 50 guest coming up next week, which is another
Number 50.
awesome episode. Then, yeah, you believe we're at 50? I mean, holy
Unreal.
cow.
Rolling.
Ugh, yeah, it's amazing. So, yeah, I want to thank the listeners also for coming on once again. Everybody who leaves us a 5-star review on the podcast app on your iPhone or Stitcher or Podbean, wherever you guys go, thank you so much for doing that. We're going to be coming out with some merchandise in the future, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Some apparel. And, if you want to hear more of our episodes, Brian's been hammering the YouTube page with good content. I've been putting a few up there and putting our episodes up there so you can listen to them there. Facebook and Instagram are always on fire every day. And then, habitatpodcast.com, the website. You can see it all there, read all the notes, and catch up on anything that you may have not heard. So, once again, thank you to the listeners for coming on. I want to thank our sponsors before we wrap this up. Michigan Whitetail Pursuit, Killer Food Plots, the Habitat Hook, Packer Max Call to Packers, and Dip That Hydrographics. Thank you all for supporting the podcast. We really appreciate your support and can't do it without you. So, Brian, anything else on your end before we shut this down?
Anybody out there that's still doing a rain dance, you can stop now. I think we got enough. At least in the north. I know some of the guys are suffering a little bit down south and haven't had any rain, but
Yes.
we've had plenty of it.
Yes, that's true. Probably start putting tarps over the food plots, catching it, putting it into barrels, and shipping it south. I mean,
Yeah.
it is soaking. But no, you're right. Stop with the rain dances. So, thank you for that. Once again, everybody, thanks for tuning in as we become better habitat managers. We will see you next time, episode 50.